Today we are going to facet an X-Cube, which looks like a cube and it's made of glass, but there's an X in there with, I think, plated films of some kind that are colored, and they are some kind of dichroic film meshed together and held together in some way. So it's several individual pieces of glass, I think, kind of glued or whatever together. I've heard a couple different opinions on how best to orient this for maximum colorification. My friend who I got this piece from faceted it with this being the crown and culet directions, so the X was kind of in the middle of the crown, and that looked really cool. I've also heard from a couple of sources that you want the center of the X to be in the line of the girdle, and so in that case, this is the X, you would want the X to be in this direction, and you would want that center point of the X to be along the girdle here. And I heard from one person that you want this to be offset as much as possible from any sort of symmetry in order to get the best effect, which I think makes a lot of sense. You know, if I faceted it sort of in this orientation, even without doing anything, you're getting 8 different colors in there. Whereas if I faceted it with this being up, it would rely on the light going in and bouncing around, which it should do, and then coming out in different colors. I think what I'm going to do is try to facet it sort of with an angled side pointing upward and having the X go in kind of an oblique direction out of the crystal, which means I'll grind down along this plane here to make this the table. Maybe not quite perpendicular to the corner here, maybe I'll go at a slight angle, just so I don't start losing a lot of one of the films in particular. And the design we're going to be doing today is an easy opposing square design by Voltolini. This is available for free on the Gemology Project wiki/database. You can see there's going to be bars going in this orientation on the crown, and then on the pavilion they're in sort of opposing directions. And when those are overlaid on each other, you get almost a pixelated effect, which I've always wanted to do one of these stones. And I thought this cube would be a really good idea to, just have it in this orientation, but obviously I'm going to make it more difficult to myself and have to make new sides to the square here. And as the name implies, this is an easy design. There's only 23 facets, 8 of which are on the girdle, and 4 of those girdle facets are very small nicks, and so you don't even have to do those necessarily. So you could go as few as 19 facets. I may put in the nicks just because it's going to be a relatively large stone still. We're starting out at about a 15mm cube here. Maybe we'll wind up with 10 or so, I'm not sure what we're gonna cut down to. And this design is made for 1.54 refractive index materials. This was a test cut in quartz and looked interesting. And glass has a identical or very similar refractive index to quartz. The glass can vary by quite a bit, but I think 154 is a pretty good starting point. Our first step is going to be to grind off some of this cube in order to make a flat that I can dop up and start working on the pavilion. Here's where we are after the 1200 grit stage. The 600 grit went fairly quickly because it's just a few facets. But as you can see here, those aren't exactly perfectly polished faces on those 3 tiers that go up to the culet. And I'm not sure exactly if that's because I just had too much subsurface damage that I didn't clean out with my 600, although I think I went down a relatively far ways and thought I cleaned it up okay, but still wound up with those scratches. So I'm just going to forge ahead and see if the 50,000 grit diamond will polish out. You can see there's a pretty major one right in the middle of that main facet there. Because this is glass, it has a tendency, I think, to kind of chip and cause scratches and kind of scratch itself. You can actually see the culet, the very tip of the pavilion here, is a little bit jagged. I don't know if the polishing will polish that out or not, but this is just a fun little experiment, so I'm not looking for perfection here. It's kind of fun to facet. It changes colors in different light. Every, turn makes a new color. And we'll see what it looks like when it's all polished up. Well, my past is catching up with me already. Started to polish, and on the girdle had an issue with one area, but powered through it okay. But I'm already starting to see problems come in with polishing this face here. This is the first part of the pavilion that I polished. And there's a scratch here and a scratch here, and those are from chips coming off the edge of the girdle here and scraping across the surface. Those scratches weren't there when I first started. And I think that's going to be a problem moving forward throughout this whole crystal, and so it's going to be kind of a pain to do all this because getting those scratches out at this stage takes a really long time. Or I have to really overload my diamond powder, which I don't really want to do. So I think we're going to change tactics a little bit and move to a 600, go back to a 600 by New Bond resin embedded diamond disc, and just redo the whole thing, cut down a little bit more, maybe get rid of some of the fractures or internal stresses that maybe cutting on the 100 grit disc that I used, which is probably too coarse for the glass that is this X-Cube. As soon as I started to polish on the girdle, I immediately felt something break off, and there was a small chip in the girdle, which I got rid of for the most part. And that was probably because of the 100 grit that I didn't get out with the 600 or 1200 grit stages. So we're gonna have to backtrack, unfortunately, which I've heard this can be a problem with glass. It can be a little finicky and chippy and scratchy. And I think I will also, instead of going on the 50,000 grit diamond on tin, I'll try my phenolic lap with cerium oxide, which is supposed to be good for polishing glass. But the first step is to get these scratches out, because they look pretty terrible right now. The 600 New Bond cuts really slow, almost more like a 1200, and so I went and just cut back with my 600 topper, and this is after the 1200 grit, going over everything one more time to even it out. And there's a slight scuff up near at the top facet here. You can kind of see just a little bit of dark line right there. But I think that'll come out in polish, which I will still do the cerium oxide, just so I don't mess up my tin lap. But it already looks really good, I think. Lots of colors coming through from the top view. And we should just have to kind of kiss it with the cerium oxide to polish things up, and then we'll be good to go and move on to the crown. Cut in at 180 grit to just rough things into shape, get rid of a lot of the excess. Very simple, just a few facets. They're relatively large though, which is what makes this stone difficult. You can see there, maybe you can see it's blue when we're looking head on and kind of goldy looking from the side. I'm not sure if it's going to be dominated by this blue when we finish, but we'll have to find out when we take it off the dop. And the X is coming up through the pavilion over on this top part of the pavilion and goes down into the stone kind of at this angle towards the culet of the pavilion. So we should get all the colors in there to some extent, which is what I was hoping for. It's probably difficult to tell, but there is a little bit of offset in angle from the facet on the top of the calipers here to the girdle on the bottom. It's a little bit angled where it should be parallel, but I'm not worried about that with just the 180 grit because it's so coarse. What I'm going to do next is switch to the 600 grit, and that's where I'll do my leveling and kind of place the facets where I want them to be, because the 1200 doesn't really cut them very much and the polish cuts them even less. So my placing is done mostly with the 600 grit. Here we are at the 1200 grit stage, ready for the final polish, and I was having a little bit of trouble with some scratches on this stone. It was very chippy, and after the 600 stage, I had to be very careful with the edges, especially the trailing edges, which started to chip out when I went a little too rough with it. But after the 1200 stage, I think most of those have been taken out. There may still be a little bit of chipping if you look at under a loop at the edges over here or on the other side. What I was actually having the most trouble with was if I oriented the stone where the lap was running up and down this way, sort of across the face the short way. And I was having a lot of trouble with chipping along the girdle or even along the other facets here, and dragging those chips up along the stone and causing deep gouges, which I think is what caused the previous scratches that I had to go back to the 600 for on the pavilion. And in order to circumvent that, I basically just had to maintain the stone sort of long ways along the lap in all of my stages, and that pretty much eliminated that problem. But I do have to be careful with that even in the polishing stage, because we can get those scratches here now, and I really don't want to have to go over this whole thing again. And I believe that the scuff marks that are on there will polish out pretty readily.